So passwords have been the bane of the IAM world for decades, but a passwordless future is looking better and better each day. And today we are excited to talk with Okta about the benefits of passwordless authentication and what we should consider before we take the leap. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Teju. Thanks for joining us.
Cool, thanks, Christine. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, hi everyone. In this presentation, we're going to talk about moving beyond passwords and how passwordless authentication is kind of starting to become top of mind for organizations as we start to think about how we've already implemented multi-factor authentication and how we can move past that to go passwordless. And I'm Teju. I'm on the product marketing team at Okta. My focus is across our adaptive authentication products. So anything that covers like multi-factor authentication, device-based security, any of the endpoint security integration tools and other security vendors that we integrate with is my focus area. But for today's presentation, what the main points that I'll be covering for passwordless are: one, the history of using passwords and really how it came to be that everyone uses a password for web-based authentication for online accounts today. The second are some considerations before going passwordless, some trends that we've been seeing in the industry. And then lastly, designing your passwordless authentication experience. This is really where we'll cover some of the capabilities that are available for in Okta for you to go passwordless, and also go through how you can get started on that passwordless journey. So with that, let's go ahead and start with the first topic, which is a history of using passwords. So of course, all of you know that passwords are commonplace today. It's obviously the most common method that we use to log into web applications. But I think it's safe to say that passwords really now should be in the past. So the first origin of the password goes back to the Roman times, when we had this concept of watchwords, and then it kind of evolved into challenge response in later years. But really the main concept of password came to be at MIT in the 1960s when they used it for this timeshare user management application that they had. And then of course, now in the internet era, we again use username and password combinations on a daily basis to authenticate into both enterprise applications. That would include things like Office 365, Salesforce, and others, and then also for, of course, consumer applications. So again, really passwords have become commonplace. Everyone knows how to use them. And we know that because passwords are so commonplace, they're actually no longer good enough. Unfortunately, we know that most credential and sharing and breaches increase the risk of account takeover. Increased user friction leads to a poor user experience, and managing passwords results in increased IT and support costs. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that many credential-based breaches are caused by passwords. So if you think about the passwords that people use, we tend to use the same passwords across multiple applications, both enterprise and consumer. Sometimes we even share passwords amongst each other or use very common passwords that are found in breaches. Like if you think about password 123 or easy to guess passwords like that. This is one of the primary reasons that hacking related breaches use weak or stolen passwords. So again, we know that passwords are no longer good enough, and it's time to, first of all, secure the authentication process, but ultimately move to a form of authentication that doesn't actually require a password at all. So that takes us to the evaluation of the current authentication methods that are out there. It really comes down to thinking about the assurance level that's associated with the different authentication methods that are available, as well as the end user experience that you get with these authentication methods. So again, if we start with passwords, we know that the user experience is generally okay or good because, again, people are familiar with passwords, but at the same time, they do tend to forget passwords, so that diminishes that user experience. So overall, it's average. But the assurance level with passwords is very low because, of course, they're easy to breach. And then we go into passwords plus 2FA or passwords plus multi-factor authentication. Hopefully, a lot of you have already implemented multi-factor authentication at your workplace, but also hopefully on your own consumer accounts. So this is where we see a password plus something like an SMS OTP, a mobile authenticator app, or a biometric, basically something that you choose to prove who you are, who you say you are, along with using the password. With this one, the end user experience may be a little bit diminished because, of course, it takes a longer time for the user to log in. When you're using factors like SMS OTP, that's a little bit more familiar for users, so it may not hinder the experience too much, but overall it does slow the time of login down. But at the same time, of course, it offers a higher level of assurance than using just a password. And then lastly, we have biometric-based authentication. This could be done either through passwordless or just using a biometric as your second factor. Today, the biometric form of authentication is considered the most secure and provides the best user experience because, one, it's a very quick way to log in, but a lot of the biometrics are actually built into devices. So when you think about the face recognition on Windows devices like Windows Hello, Touch ID on MacBook, Face ID on iOS, all of those forms of biometric authentication are built into the device. So users are already familiar with how to use it, making it an easy way to log in for both enterprise applications as well as consumer applications. So when we think about the ideal authentication experience, what organizations need to focus on, or what you want to think about, is, of course, having an exceptional user experience, the correct security protections against phishing and other identity attacks, providing admins with controls and visibility to detect when something goes wrong. Of course, we want the solutions that we choose to be scalable, but also cost effective, so that your support team is not inundated with requests because of this change in the user experience. So this is where we think passwordless authentication can help solve some of the challenges and also deliver on the promise of a better end user experience. So that takes us into the second topic, which is a couple of considerations and examples of going passwordless. So a couple of years ago, fairly recently, actually maybe early last year, Google did a survey of some of its own customers and employees and actually found that passwordless authentication using security keys like a YubiKey, for example, was the best option to date. It was better than using knowledge factors as passwordless to stop account takeover incidents. So what this really means is that there's different options for passwordless out there. You could basically continue to use your secondary factor like a security question or SMS OTP as your primary factor, or go through different forms of passwordless, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But the benefits don't end there, right? So it was found that when using passwordless authentication, the cost per user is actually very low, which then allows you to scale without increasing support costs. So this goes back to both the scalability and the TCO question. Are the factors that you're going to use to go passwordless scalable for a distributed workforce? And then also, will they actually help to reduce costs, including the cost of support incidents? So that's another consideration to think about. And then lastly, the survey also indicated that passwordless authentication methods were consistently faster to authenticate than any other form of authentication, which of course drives a better end user experience. And this one is kind of expected, right? When you go passwordless, you don't have a password to type in, you don't have a password to remember. You can just use something like a security key, biometric, or OTP to get into your account, which of course reduces the time to authenticate and ultimately delivers a better end user experience. Now, the other thing that you want to think about here, which is kind of indicated on the chart, is that you have employees, but then you also have consumer users. So on the employee side, which basically you can consider that the workforce side, some factors are more reasonable than others to actually get deployed to your workforce. For example, if you did want to use security tokens or deploy new hardware that supports biometrics, that makes sense on the workforce/employee side. But then if you're an organization that's also building applications for consumers and you want to provide passwordless authentication for consumers, in that case, Sending out a security key to all of the consumers of your application doesn't make sense. You also can't send them new hardware. So you kind of have to think about the best options to go passwordless on that side as well. So on the consumer side, you may be thinking about things like SMS OTP, which again is a somewhat familiar experience for consumer applications today. Or you may even be dependent on the user using new phones and such that support biometrics to support that passwordless experience. So there's different considerations to think about, again, on the employee side, as well as on the consumer side. So that takes us to the next topic, which is understanding how to actually design your passwordless authentication experience. So there's a couple of thoughts here before going passwordless, right? This could, again, be for the employee workforce side or the consumer side. But there's really 4 key areas that you want to think about before starting that journey. The first one is to understand the nature of the security threats that you have. So if you want to go passwordless, you also want to understand what are you actually trying to protect your organization against. For example, are you seeing a lot of password spray attacks, credential stuffing, man in the middle, man in the browser? And what threats are you going to try and prevent by going passwordless? And one of the things to know here is a great way to lay the foundation for going passwordless is to actually first implement multi-factor authentication. The reason for that is that, as you saw in the previous slide, a lot of these factor types that you use for passwordless can actually be used for MFA as well. So for example, if you're using like SMS OTP or some type of security token for MFA, you can ultimately use those same ones to go passwordless. So it's good to have a foundation first. The next one is to understand the technology in play. So you want to understand how users are accessing their applications, or in the case of consumer use cases, how users are accessing your service, what devices are users accessing your service from. Again, in the case of the workforce or employee, you want to know, what kind of laptops you have deployed. Those laptops support like biometric capabilities for multi-factor authentication or passwordless. Do you have a BYOD strategy in place where users can use like a mobile authenticator app on their phone to use for MFA or passwordless? A couple of different considerations there. But along with the technology in place, you also want to think about the level of assurance that's actually required for your business. So like I talked about before, different authentication methods have different levels of assurance associated with them. Of course, password would be the lowest level of assurance, but as we move into using things like security keys, biometrics, that adds a higher level of assurance. So you essentially want to take a look at what is the accepted risk for these different authentication methods that you want to use. The next one is the user behavior and user groups. You want to understand the user journey for all of your users. How are they registering into the service? How are they authenticating? If their account gets locked out for any reason or they need to recover their account, how are they going to do that without having a password in place? For example, if an end user's account gets locked out for whatever reason and they need to recover it, are you going to allow them to use their own factor type to recover the account? And then that also brings us to mapping out the actual end user experience of passwordless and the factors that you choose to use. So we want to understand how the impact of each technology reduces user friction during the authentication process. And then lastly, we want to map the cost of deploying each technology. There's some passwordless options out there, like SMS OTP, for example, is pretty low cost, both on the workforce side and the consumer side. Really, the reason for that is that everyone has a phone. People are familiar with using SMS and how it works. So that would be considered a more low cost, easy to deploy option. But then we have options that, again, offer higher level of assurance, like biometrics on the device. But of course, that could increase your cost because it's likely that you'll have to deploy new hardware. So you really just have to take a look at what makes the most sense for your business, what's the most cost effective, and what's going to offer the most secure experience, but also offer a good experience for your users. And then a few additional considerations. Going passwordless does have some additional considerations that we want to think about. The first is adoption, right? So customers are used to passwords, and many users depend on password managers. But passwordless authentication, of course, breaks down these known existing user patterns. So in many cases, especially on the workforce or employee side, you would probably want to send out like communications and do trainings for users and such so that they understand how the passwordless authentication experience is different from what they're used to today. And then next, for the authentication experience, you want to think about how you're actually going to have your users enrolled into the factors that you choose, and hopefully those factors will ultimately be used for passwordless authentication. There's probably many situations where you need to support multiple authentication options to ensure that you have options when users who have not enrolled or don't have a device that supports passwordless, what's their backup at that point. Or what's going to happen if you have enabled like SMS OTP, for example, and a user loses their phone. What are your options there? That's something you want to think about. And this is the case for deploying both multi-factor authentication as well as going passwordless. And then lastly, for many enterprises, you need to consider the security and compliance requirements that your business may need to adhere to when deploying multi-factor authentication and passwordless. So again, this basically comes back down to it could be the cost that's associated with the factors that you choose to use, but also are these factors meeting the requirements of the business. So from there, we can look at a couple of different options for passwordless in Okta's product today, and then also talk about a couple of things coming down the future in the roadmap that you can look forward to in the next couple of months. But the first few that I want to focus on that are available in the product today, the first one is factor sequencing. The second one is WebAuthn or FIDO 2.0. And then the next one is email link credentials, also called email magic links. So let's start with the first one here, which is factor sequencing. So with factor sequencing, the way that it works in Okta is the admins essentially define a factor chain in the admin console. That factor chain decides how a user is going to log into Okta. So if you take a look at the screenshot here, for example, what the admin is saying is that when a user logs in, all their policies are going to be evaluated. And then from there, they need to provide a FIDO 2 factor or WebAuthn. But in addition to that, they also need to provide another factor to log in. That factor could be something like Google Authenticator, Okta Verify Push, or password. So you can see that you can essentially chain the different factors that are supported in Okta together to deliver the best end user experience, but also the most secure experience based on the factors that are made available for your users. But ultimately, what you can do with factor sequencing is forego the password altogether in the authentication process. So another thing that you could do as an administrator is, for example, say, okay, if a user logs in with FIDO 2.0, they don't need any additional authentication here. So you can basically have a line here that says none. Or if you're familiar with users just providing something like Okta Verify Push and no other factor type, you can set that in the chain as well. But also, if you need to continue using passwords, you can do that through factor sequencing. So if you take a look at the top chain here, you have password plus whatever factors are made available for your users. So the security outcomes that you get with factor sequencing, first, of course, you can go passwordless. The next one is that you're presenting specific factors based on the login context. The next one is that this will still help you to meet compliance requirements. And in cases where you need to, you can do the standard prompt for MFA. That could be the usual password plus another factor, or it could be two factors chained together. So this factor sequencing capability is available in the product today, and it gives you a level of high assurance, especially when you're using stronger factors like WebAuthn or a mobile authenticator app like Okta Verify Push. And it also allows admins to dynamically control which factors are made available to different user groups. The other thing that I wanted to call out about this feature or about factor sequencing is that you can also combine it with the other adaptive policies that are in Okta. For example, you can combine this with geolocation, IP, and network policies as well, where you could say, okay, if a user is logging in from a network that Okta has seen in the past, all they need to do is provide one type of factor. Could be a biometric, could be a mobile authenticator app. But if this login is coming in from a new network, new location, or a new device, you might want to chain multiple factors together. So again, you do have flexibility in how you want those factors to be presented to end users. And then the next feature that I wanted to talk about in Okta is WebAuthn. So many of you may already be familiar with WebAuthn. It's also, you have probably seen it as FIDO 2.0. Previously, we had FIDO 1.0, which was U2F, and that's now evolved into FIDO 2.0, web authentication. This is essentially the new standard for web-based passwordless authentication. A couple of more practical examples of where WebAuthn exists is, like I mentioned before, for newer Windows devices, like the Windows Hello camera would be considered a WebAuthn factor. The Touch ID on MacBooks, the Face Unlock and fingerprint on Android devices, those are all considered WebAuthn factors. And the reason that these are this is probably the best factor option to go passwordless in the future is that it's actually the only phishing resistant factor on the market today. So a couple of things to note about WebAuthn is that the biometrics are local to the device. So it never leaves the secure key, the secure container on the device. And then there's also support for both on-device authenticators, like again, the Windows Hello camera or Touch ID on MacBook, but also external authenticators like security tokens. If we think about YubiKey, for example, they do have FIDO 2.0 supported tokens. So you have different options here for getting it enabled for your users. But ultimately in Okta, you can use WebAuthn / FIDO 2.0 in that factor sequencing model that I showed you previously. So again, what you could do is say, okay, if Okta has seen this device before, has seen this network before, just provide a WebAuthn factor and you're good to go. So it's up to you on how you want to make those options available for your users. But ultimately with WebAuthn, what you get is a high assurance against a wide range of attack types, including the attacks that target stolen credentials, good user experience and privacy. The WebAuthn login experience is a very great one for users because the biometric is embedded on the device. The login process is very quick. And then also you have lowered support costs. Okay. And then the next capability, this one is more on the consumer side, is email magic link. Some of you are probably familiar with this one also. You may have already seen it using other applications, but essentially what happens is that when you go to either register your account for an online service or log into a service, rather than entering username and password, what you do is just enter your email address, and then that application sends a link to your email. You click on the link, that takes you back into the application. So this is another form of passwordless that you can implement for your users. We see it more frequently in consumer use cases, not widely used in the employee workforce use case, but it's still possible to implement it if you did want to. This one is to basically simplify the login experience for users. One enterprise application that you may actually have seen this. All right, sorry, I think my speakers went out for a second there, but it should be good now. But one example where you may have seen the email magic link used even on the enterprise space is for Slack. So for those of you who may remember logging into Slack, what they do is actually ask you to enter your email address into the application. So rather than typing out like your full username and password or your Slack workspace, they actually send a link into your email. You click on that email, on the link in your email, and that takes you to the Slack application. So that's essentially how this email magic link would work. And you can use Okta's service to add that capability into your application. So with the email magic link, of course, it's easy to use, very simple for users. All they need to do is click on the link in their email. It's cost effective. There's no hardware requirements for deployment. And you can back up the authentication process. You can bootstrap users into your service, before you offer them higher assurance passwordless models. So those are the main capabilities that we have for passwordless authentication in Okta today. There are a couple of other ones as well for those of you who are maybe familiar with Okta. We have things like desktop single sign-on. We have integrations with endpoint tools that allow you to go passwordless, but these are the ones that I wanted to focus on. So from there, I wanted to get into some of the roadmap capabilities that we have coming that I'm excited about that are specific to passwordless authentication. So when we look at the future of passwordless in Okta, like I mentioned, we do have a wide set of passwordless capabilities. Today, I went through the factor sequencing, WebAuthn, and email magic link. But we recently announced a feature that'll be available in a couple of months called Okta FastPass, which offers device-based passwordless experiences. So at a high level, what happens with FastPass is that regardless of what device you're using, it could be Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android, regardless if the device is a D-joined managed by an endpoint management tool. Once that device gets registered to Okta, the end user has a passwordless authentication experience into all of the applications that may be sitting behind Okta. So if you think about what that could look like as an end user, you open up your laptop, you log in to the laptop with no password, maybe using the Touch ID on your MacBook. And then from there, you just open up a browser. You can go straight to your Okta dashboard or straight to an application like Office 365. You won't be prompted for any additional credentials. So that's what we have coming in the future with Okta FastPass. But I wanted to highlight how exactly that's going to work as well. So some of you may already be familiar with our Okta Verify application. It's essentially our mobile authenticator app that we use for MFA. It supports OTP as well as push notifications. So on a day-to-day basis, when users log in to their applications, on the admin side, you can choose to prompt them for multi-factor authentication using Okta Verify. So that application is available today on iOS and Android, but we also want to use Okta Verify to support a much larger set of use cases, specifically focusing on device-based access and device-based security. So one of the changes that we're making to Okta Verify is actually making it available on all major platforms. So again, we have it available today on Android and iOS, but it also be expanded to Windows and Mac devices. And this is really going to be what drives these device-based access decisions. So the first one is that we'll use Okta Verify to facilitate Okta FastPass, the passwordless feature that I just mentioned. And then in addition to that, even though it's not super relevant to this conversation, Okta Verify will also be the integration layer for all the integrations that we have with endpoint detection and response vendors, as well as endpoint management tools. And then over the next 12 to 18 months past that, Okta Verify will really be the foundation for all device context-based access decisions. So this includes things like native operating system level checks that are done directly through the Okta Verify app. We've gotten very good at security for managed devices where customers have an endpoint management tool, but we also want to enable that same level of security for BYOD. So with these updates, you'll be able to check for the security posture of the device without actually having an endpoint tool on it. So how we see this working is that Okta Verify will essentially facilitate both the passwordless experience that you get with FastPass plus some of these security posture checks, both natively and through integrations. So again, highlighting that FastPass feature, I'll briefly go through what it would look like on the end user side. So it's going to start by the user registering their device in Okta. That's really what enables the feature to work. So once you've registered your device, and the registration can happen passwordless as well. So again, if you're using a device that supports biometrics, you could even prompt for that during the registration experience rather than the standard username and password. And then from there, regardless of where the user is located, once they've logged into the device, they automatically have access to their applications. They won't be prompted for any additional credentials. And then on the admin side, you can choose to deliver this FastPass experience on managed devices, which means devices that are managed by an endpoint management tool, or simply on devices that have just registered to Okta. So the device may not be managed by an endpoint management tool, but we do have a record of the device in Okta's directory. And again, From after that one-time device registration, once you've logged into the device, no additional password prompts. So this is a capability that will be available in the product in the upcoming months. So from there, I just want to briefly talk through how you can get started with some of these capabilities, how you can use multi-factor authentication to really lay the foundation of passwordless, and then later on take a look at the features that I mentioned, like email magic link, factor sequencing, and WebAuthn, and then ultimately look at FastPass. So when we recommend that when you think about going passwordless, you map it out as a journey. Again, we showed this to you earlier, but it's really based on the assurance level and the factor types that are available to you. So we have the first one that's available in the product today, the email magic link, which offers an average assurance level, but is very easy for users to use. The second one, factor sequencing, chaining two high assurance factors together. You build assurance models based on risk, and then also create these policies based on login context that you already have about that login, like new device, network, IP, all that type of information. And then lastly, we have WebAuthn, which is really the standards-driven approach to passwordless that is accepted as the web-based authentication standard for passwordless today. Like I said before, this is really the only phishing-proof factor that's on the market that helps you protect against these common identity attacks. And then this one will also offer the best end-user experience, and it also offers support for biometrics that are built into the device, as well as security tokens. And that's what we had for you today on this topic of moving beyond passwords. Hope it was insightful, and I think now we can get into the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Teju. We do have a couple of questions here. The first one is, how can we get end users to buy into passwordless?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. It's always, you're always going to have some people that are fighting against, changes that are coming. But I think the best way to do it is, may sound really basic and simple, but it's just employee communications to actually let them know how their login experience is going to change. That's the first one, but also how you're making it better. Of course, if you can spin it around and say this is actually a better experience for you, it's a faster login experience, it's better, better security on your account, I think that's the best way to get users to buy into it. And then the other thing is that if you take a phased approach to your passwordless deployment, you can have users that are already on passwordless that kind of vouch for you and the decisions that you're making to help the rest of the organization buy into it.
Great. And are there, hold on, I'm just looking for another one. Are there easy methods of enabling passwordless?
There could be some methods that are quicker than others. Like I said, if you have these newer hardware types that have like biometrics built into the device, that's a fairly fast way of enabling it. Also, if you've already implemented some form of multi-factor authentication, and you, especially secure multi-factor authentication, that's also laying a good foundation for you to eventually go passwordless. I wouldn't recommend it if your MFA today is on the lower assurance side, like if you're using security questions, for example, or even SMS OTP. Sometimes those are considered less secure. But other than that, I think, yeah, implementing MFA and then also choosing MFA and passwordless with these new devices that have biometrics is a good way to start.